Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about how the spirit of Vatican II, that generation, is dying and is almost dead. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et saeculi saeculorum. Amen. I think most of you guys are familiar with the term the Spirit of Vatican II. What is the Spirit of Vatican II? Well, Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, was convened in 1962 and ended in 1965. It was thought up by Saint John the 23rd, and he died prior to it ending. He died in 1963, and then Pope Paul the VI, Saint Paul the VI, finished it off in 1965. And look, we're not going to get into is Vatican II a legitimate council? Is Vatican II, did it change church teachings? We're not going to really focus on that right now. What we're going to talk about is that what ushered from that was what we would call the Spirit of Vatican II. And I think you would see it most in a couple areas. One would be the liturgy, no doubt. Now, the change from the Latin Mass, and we're talking about Latin Rite, okay? We're not going to talk about the Eastern Rites. The change from the Latin Rite to the vernacular was not actually a result of Vatican II. If you go through the documents of Vatican II, like Musica Sacram and Lumen Gentium, the Mass isn't covered. But that was part of the Spirit of Vatican II. And we talked about it on some of the past episodes. Annibale Bonini, the main architect behind the Novus Ordo Mass, his shady connections, to Freemasonry, and he was open on record saying that he wanted a new Mass that was similar to Cromwell's Mass. Cromwell, of course, 16th century change agent who changed or took through the work of Henry VIII, and then his son Edward took England from Catholicism to what later would be Anglicanism or Episcopalianism. Either way, so that was part of it. One of them was that. The other fruit that you could say from the Spirit of Vatican II, the main one was the liturgy changing, and it changed radically. And then some of it was just kind of the postmodernist thinking, the moral relativism, the things that you think of Pius IX in the mid-19th century warned about in the Syllabus of Errors. You think of course, St. Pius X, early 20th century Pope, talked about, he made all the priests do an oath to modernism, against modernism, I should say. But really, it was those kind of two things that really came into the spirit of Vatican II. Because if you look at the words of Vatican II, they're not necessarily as proportionate or commensurate to what really happened after Vatican II. And that was more like, well, it's kind of like the Constitution. There's strict constitutional interpreters and loose. And the loose interpreters are like, anything that the federal government doesn't prohibit, anything the Constitution doesn't prohibit the federal government from doing, the federal government can do it, a la like universal insurance. But the strict interpretational people would say, like, the federal government can only do what the Constitution says it can do. It was kind of like with Vatican II. So you had the loose interpreters that are like, well, it didn't specifically say we could do all these things, but, it's part of the change. As John the 23rd said, we have to open up the window, let this fresh air. And so they ran with it. No doubt there were change agent cardinals and bishops and theologians at the time who ran with this spirit of change. You think of the 60s, mid-60s, late 60s in particular, early 70s, how a lot of things were changing at this time, and they went with it. And so the spirit of Vatican II, you see it most in the Mass, right? Switching away from the Ad Orientem, putting the tabernacles in different rooms, changing into like a little room. The church architecture fundamentally changes to a more Protestant form. We talked about on that episode on the great Michael Rose book, Ugly as Sin, really chronicles it well. Of course, the folk music that was ushered in, and just the watering down of the catechesis, and then you saw all the fruits of that. You saw the lowering of all the sacraments, lowering of baptisms, lowering of marriages. You saw the decrease of vocations, etc., etc., etc. My point is this, 5 minutes in, is that these people are dying out. These people are dying out. If you look at like who the change agents were, maybe they're like 40 years old in the mid-60s. These people would be 100 years old. So they're all dead. And then you see the people that were fundamental and pivotal in this time, a lot of them are dying out. And one of the kind of genesis of this episode is that the chief theologian behind liberation theology, Gutierrez, he died recently, and he wrote one of the fundamental works of liberation theology, that Marxist hybrid, the early kind of social justice stuff, and a lot of that came out of Latin America in the 60s and 70s. Ratzinger at the time, way before he was Pope, and John Paul, when he was Pope, they all decried liberation theology as just Marxist painting of Catholicism. Anyways, he died. He was in his mid-80s. And so you even look at the people that were young at the time, that were influenced by the spirit of Vatican II. A lot of these people, let's say they were born in 1950, they were teenagers or early 20s at that time, they're 74. And so you look at, like, in your parish, a lot of the spirit of Vatican II people are dying off. These people really dominated your parish in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, some still dominate today. The second generation of those that were imbued in the spirit of Vatican II, which are typically going to be liberal Catholics. We have an early episode here. There's no such thing as a liberal Catholic. You're either practicing your faith the best you can, or you're not a Catholic. But either way, these people dominated the parishes for a long time, and they were totally fine with the priests that were also wanting to change things, change some of the theology, right? Like the multiplication of loaves really didn't happen. That was symbolism, and Sodom wasn't destroyed for its homosexual nature, but for its lack of hospitality. All this kind of theology came in, and of course, all the major changes to the Mass and to the buildings and all this. These people are dying out. All these people are dying out. Sure, there's still going to be some cardinals and some bishops that are very kind of inspired by this. Some would argue that Francis, no doubt, is inspired by the spirit of Vatican II, and the idea behind the Synod of Synodality, as it just finished not that long ago, its second convocation, is part of the spirit of Vatican II. But I think we need to take solace in the fact that if you look at the seminaries, which were just a hotbed of impropriety during the spirit of Vatican II the last 50 years, but if you look at the seminaries, they've largely been cleaned up. If you look at the priests coming out of the seminary, large majority of them are young and Orthodox and on fire. And so you see the kind of the fruits of the spirit of Vatican II people dying out. And what we're going to have is a resurgence. It's going to be a smaller church. We've talked about in the episode, what is American Catholicism going to look like in 30 years? It's certainly going to be a smaller church, as Ratzinger predicted, as even the book of Revelation predicts. Right? There's going to be people that are going to turn their back and apostatize. But the Catholic Church that's coming out after the spirit of Vatican II is going to be Orthodox again. And people like me, I'm age 50, I grew up, I wouldn't say at the height of it, but kind of 10 years after the height of it, but certainly in that window where I went to a Catholic university that did the interpretive dance during the Our Father, and I went to Catholic schools my whole life, so I can kind of chronicle and detail all these things. But my generation, the Gen Xers and the boomers that stayed traditional, we endured this time. And now, like a squall, and you're that small boat, you can see the clearing in the horizon. And I truly think that once these people fully die out, and yes, they're going to have their successors, people that they inspired, of course, but their preponderance or their power in overall Catholicism has waned quite a bit. And I know you can't see it on the macro level when I talk about like the Vatican, because the Vatican and the Curia still have, unfortunately, disproportionately a lot of these people. But if you look on the microcosmic level at your parish, if you think about like the pastor you grew up with who was very modernist, he's dead, he's gone. And if you look at the new priests that are filling up or replacing these old modernist priests, the majority of them are Orthodox, and they're going to slowly bring back traditional things to the parish in the form of the liturgy and other things. And so I think we do have to take hope. And if I'm still around in 20, 30 years, and if you're still around in 20, 30 years, I think you're going to see the spirit of Vatican II way gone. And it's like a pendulum. All those excesses that went super high in the 70s, 80s, and 90s on every level in Catholicism, now it's going to go back. And I think we're going to go back to good traditional Catholicism. where there's no moral relativism, there's no postmodernist thinking like, well, what's good for you is not necessarily good for me, and the theology of the church is always evolving, and we have to look at the spirit of the time. No, all that's going to go out the window. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you if you agree or disagree. Until next time, take care. God bless. Pray.